Rosalind Vane had been on her knees in the mud for the better part of 2 hours, and she had no intention of apologizing for it. The walled kitchen garden at Ashmore Park was in a state. That was the only word for it. 14 years of neglect had turned what the estate records described as a productive garden of considerable distinction into a tangle of collapsed trellises, suffocated soil, and roses so wildly overgrown they had eaten 3 of the original stone pathways whole. Her task was to resurrect it. 6 weeks. Full payment on completion, the kind of contract that could clear a woman's debts and rebuild a reputation in a single season, if she didn't waste a single morning. She was not wasting this morning. "Move it 18 inches south," she said, without looking up from the soil sample crumbling between her fingers. The pH was wrong. Too acidic by half, which explained the dead lavender, the yellowing sage, and the general air of botanical misery that hung over the south bed like a verdict. She would need to amend the entire border before a single new plant went in. Behind her, Thomas set down the measuring line and moved it without question. He had worked for her for 4 years. He knew better than to argue about 18 inches. The soil told her things if she listened. This particular patch told her it had been waterlogged repeatedly. Poor drainage, compacted by foot traffic, starved of light by the overgrown wall ivy. Whoever had managed this garden last had not been managing it. They had been ignoring it and calling the result rustic. She reached for her trowel. "Miss Vane." She did not look up. Thomas knew not to interrupt her mid-assessment unless something was on fire. "Miss Vane," the voice came again, and this one was not Thomas. Rosalind sat back on her heels and turned. The Duke of Ashmore was standing 6 feet away, still in his riding coat, one hand resting on the stone archway that divided the kitchen garden from the formal lawn. He was taller than she had imagined from his correspondence, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, with the particular expression of a man who has just returned from an absence to find his property in a state of organized upheaval and is deciding very carefully how to feel about it. His gaze moved from her mud-caked gloves to the overturned trellises to the 3 large holes currently occupying what had been, until this morning, a perfectly level section of gravel path. "What," said the Duke of Ashmore in a voice of absolute aristocratic quiet, "has happened to my garden?" Rosalind stood, slowly. She brushed the worst of the mud from her apron, a gesture more habit than hope, and met his eyes with the steady calm of a woman who had been interrupted mid-diagnosis by powerful men before and had learned that the only correct response was to continue being right. "Your Grace." She kept her voice level. "You've arrived 3 days early." "I'm aware of when I arrived." His jaw was tight. "I asked about my garden." Behind him, through the archway, she could see 2 other figures, a woman in an immaculate grey travelling dress and beside her, a younger man in a coat that cost more than Rosalind's entire first quarter fee. Both of them were staring. She knew that look. She had been receiving that look since she was 19 years old and had shown up to her first professional consultation in work clothes rather than visiting dress. She did not adjust her posture. "Your garden," she said clearly, "is being saved." The gravel path was laid directly over clay with no drainage membrane. It was pooling water against the south wall foundations. If that continued another 2 winters, you would have lost the wall itself. She gestured to the open trenches with her trowel. "The holes are drainage channels. They'll be refilled by Thursday." The Duke looked at the holes, then at her, then at the holes again. Something shifted in his expression, something she couldn't quite name. Not anger, not quite. "You are Miss Vane," he said. "Not a question." "Rosalind Vane. Vane and Associates. You contracted my firm 6 weeks ago based on Lady Pembridge's recommendation." She held his gaze. "The recommendation you said you trusted implicitly." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Thomas was very carefully examining the middle distance. The woman in the grey dress said something behind the Duke, low, pointed, not quite audible. He didn't turn. "I see," said the Duke of Ashmore finally. Rosalind waited. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she adjusted the strap of her satchel and walked toward the gate. "Be here at 7 tomorrow morning, Your Grace," she said without turning back. "Wear clothes you don't mind ruining. And don't be late. I don't adjust my schedule for titles." She heard him exhale behind her. She thought, but could not be certain, that it might have been a laugh. She did not let herself smile until she was through the gate and the latch had clicked shut behind her. The contract was intact. The work would continue. And the Duke of Ashmore, whatever else he was not, it turned out, entirely predictable after all. That was either very good news or the beginning of a very complicated 6 weeks. She suspected, with the particular instinct she had learned to trust, that it was probably both. He was already there when she arrived. That was the first surprise. Rosalind had half expected him not to come at all, or to appear at 9, apologetic and vague, with some murmured excuse about correspondence. Instead, the Duke of Ashmore was standing at the entrance to the walled garden at 7 minutes, wearing what she could only assume was his idea of clothes he didn't mind ruining. The coat was still wool. The boots were still polished. The expression was that of a man who had made a sincere effort, and was not entirely sure it had landed. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You're wearing a cravat," she said. "I'm always wearing a cravat." "Not today, you're not." She held out her hand. He blinked. She waited. After a moment, with the expression of a man submitting to something he didn't fully understand, he unknotted it and placed it in her palm. She folded it neatly and set it on the garden wall. "You'll get it back at the end of the day. Cravats and soil work are incompatible. I won't spend the morning watching you try not to dirty it." "I wasn't going to—" "You were?" She handed him a pair of work gloves. "Put these on." He looked at the gloves. They were plain leather, slightly worn at the fingertips, sized for a large hand. He put them on without further comment. She noted that too. The morning's task was dividing the overgrown perennial clumps along the north border, lavender, catmint, and a sprawling colony of hardy geranium that had been allowed to colonize approximately 4 times its intended space. Each clump needed to be lifted, separated at the root, and replanted at correct intervals. It was methodical work. It required patience, a degree of physical effort, and the willingness to make decisive cuts. She demonstrated once. Clean, efficient, no wasted movement. "Now you," she said. The Duke of Ashmore approached the nearest lavender clump with the careful expression of a man defusing something. He inserted the fork. He pushed down. The clump did not move. "More weight," she said. He pushed harder. The fork slid sideways and came out with approximately 1 handful of soil and a single root strand. Thomas, 20 feet away, became very interested in his own work. "The fork needs to go under the root ball," Rosalind said. She kept her voice entirely neutral. "Not into it. You're not stabbing it. You're lifting it." "I understand the principle." The principle and the execution appear to be having a disagreement. He tried again. This time the fork went too deep, hit the clay layer underneath, and stuck. He pulled. The handle cracked ominously. He stopped pulling. "Leave the fork," she said. "Use your hands." "My hands." "Your hands, Your Grace. They're attached to your wrists. They work independently." He looked at her with an expression of such careful, aristocratic restraint that she felt the laugh building somewhere in her chest and had to press it firmly down. He crouched, placed both gloved hands around the base of the lavender clump, and pulled. The plant came free all at once, with considerably more soil than she had expected, and the force of it sat him neatly down in the mud. He stayed there for a moment. Rosalind looked at him. He looked at the lavender in his hands. Mud was working its way into the crease of his very good trousers. "You have the plant," she said. "I have the plant," he agreed with tremendous dignity. "That's the correct outcome." "I'm delighted to hear it." He looked up at her. Something in his expression had shifted. The rigid control of the previous day fractured slightly, like a window with a new crack in it. "Not broken, just different. Do I stand up now, or is there additional instruction I should receive from this position?" The laugh escaped before she could stop it. Just a short one, genuine, startled out of her by the precise deadpan delivery of it. She pressed her hand to her mouth immediately. His eyes warmed. "There she is," he said quietly, not unkindly. "I beg your pardon?" A real reaction. He got to his feet, the lavender still in one hand, mud comprehensively decorating his left side. "You've been managing me very carefully since yesterday evening." "That was the first thing you've said that wasn't calibrated." Rosalind recovered herself. "I laughed at a duke sitting in the mud. It was unprofessional." "It was human." He looked down at the plant. "What do I do with this now?" She showed him how to separate the root ball, where to find the natural divisions, how to tease apart the fibers rather than force them, how to identify which sections were vigorous and which were exhausted and needed to be cut away entirely. He listened with the same focused attention she had noticed the evening before. No performance of interest. Actual interest. He asked questions that showed he had retained what she said 30 seconds earlier and was building on it rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. It was, she thought, more than she had expected. By mid-morning, they had worked their way through 6 lavender clumps, 2 catmints, and the first third of the geranium colony. The Duke had improved markedly, or rather, he had stopped trying to impose his own logic on the work and had started following the logic already present in the plants. He still had the hands of a man who had never done this before, but he had stopped fighting it. They were working side by side on a particularly stubborn geranium root when he said, without looking up, "My head gardener left 18 months ago. I didn't replace him." Rosalind kept her hands moving. "Why not?" A pause. "I wasn't here enough to make it matter." She waited. "I've been elsewhere since my wife died." He said it with the flatness of a fact stated so many times it had worn smooth. "Parliament, friends' estates, anywhere with enough noise to make thinking difficult." "How long ago?" 3 years. He found the division in the root and separated it cleanly, better than she expected. Everyone said the estate would manage. The estate managed. The garden didn't. Gardens require attention, she said. They don't quietly wait. They just go. And then one day you come back and 14 years of neglect is sitting there in the soil, and you need someone with a fork and a pH meter to tell you what went wrong. He was quiet for a moment.
14 years, he said.
Your records show the last proper cultivation was 1871. My father died in 1871. He sat back on his heels and looked at the border, at the slow progress they had made through it, at the neat divisions waiting to go back into the amended earth. He loved this garden. I used to follow him through it when I was a boy. He knew the name of every plant. A brief pause. I don't know any of them. You know lavender now, Rosalind said. And catmint. And you'll know geranium by the end of the day. He looked at her. The morning light was full on his face, and she could see for the first time the exhaustion underneath the composure, real and chronic and not entirely hidden. He looked like a man who had been performing adequacy for 3 years and had recently, privately, grown very tired of it. That's an extraordinarily small consolation, he said. It's a start, she said. Everything worth having begins with a start. He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. Then he looked back at the geranium and reached for the next clump. They worked in silence for a while after that. Not uncomfortable silence, the particular silence of two people who have said something real and are allowing it to settle. Thomas moved along the border ahead of them, preparing the replanting holes at the spacing Rosalind had marked. Somewhere above the wall, a blackbird was making its views on the morning known. At noon she called a halt. The Duke of Ashmore straightened up, pulled off one glove and looked at his hands. There was mud under his fingernails, a blister forming on his right palm, a long streak of soil across his left forearm where he'd reached into a tight space without thinking. He looked at it for a moment. Well, he said. You'll feel it tomorrow, she said. The muscles across your back particularly. Something to look forward to. He looked along the border at what they had accomplished, a full third of it divided, replanted, dressed with the amended soil tamped firm. It was a modest length of garden bed. It was also unmistakably better than it had been this morning. Alive in a way it hadn't been at 7 o'clock. He looked at it for longer than she expected. It's different, he said. When you've done it yourself, you can see the... He paused, reaching for the word. The intention, she said. Yes. He glanced at her. The intention. She picked up her satchel. Thomas was already packing the tools, moving with the efficient rhythm of long practice. The afternoon crew would arrive in an hour for the drainage work. Same time tomorrow, she said. The geranium won't divide itself. No, said the Duke of Ashmore, still looking at the border. I don't suppose it will. She was halfway to the gate when he spoke again. Miss Vane? She turned. He was standing where she'd left him, still looking at the replanted lavender, hands loose at his sides, the ruined trousers and the mud on his forearm and the blister on his palm, all entirely at odds with the title and the house and the 15,000 acres that surrounded them both. Thank you, he said. For not simplifying it. She looked at him for a moment. Gardens don't simplify, she said. Neither do I. She went through the gate. Behind her, she thought she heard him say something very quietly, to himself or possibly to the lavender. She didn't catch the words. She told herself it didn't matter. She thought about it for the entire walk back to the village. Lady Miriam Ashmore arrived on a Wednesday, which was, Rosalind would later reflect, the only predictable thing about her. She came in a carriage that cost more than Ashmore Park's entire annual kitchen budget. Rosalind had no way of knowing this with certainty, but the instinct was reliable. with 2 ladies' maids, a hat box that required its own footman, and the particular energy of a woman who had decided something needed correcting and had travelled 40 miles to do it in person. Rosalind was in the glass house when the carriage arrived. She heard the wheels on the gravel, registered it distantly, and returned her attention to the seedling trays. The cucumber frames needed adjusting. The early salvia was leggy and would need pinching back before transplant. She had 12 more trays to assess before the light shifted, and she lost the angle she needed to check the root development properly. She did not go to the window. She was still in the glass house 2 hours later when Thomas appeared in the doorway with the expression he reserved for situations he considered above his professional remit. "Lady Miriam is in the walled garden," he said. Rosalind looked up from the salvia. "With the Duke?" "Without him." A pause. "He's in London. Left this morning. Back Thursday." She set down the seedling tray very carefully. "And she brought," Thomas continued. "Men," Rosalind said. "Not a question. 6 of them. With barrows." She was out of the glass house before he finished the sentence. The damage was already begun. She smelled it before she saw it. The particular sharp scent of freshly turned earth in the wrong season, the wrong place, at the wrong depth. She came through the walled garden gate and stopped. 3 of the replanted lavender divisions were out of the ground. The catmint border, 4 days of careful work, had been stripped back to bare soil. 2 of the men were working on the geranium colony with spades rather than forks, cutting rather than dividing, going too deep and too fast, destroying the root structures she and the Duke had spent an entire morning coaxing apart with their hands. One of the men saw her. He did not stop. "Stop!" Her voice came out flat and absolute. "Put the spades down." The nearest man looked up. He was broad-shouldered, unhurried, with the expression of someone who had been told to expect resistance and had decided in advance not to find it interesting. "Orders from Lady Miriam, miss. The border's being redesigned." "The border is under contract." "My contract? With the Duke of Ashmore." She kept her voice entirely controlled. The fury underneath it was considerable. She had learned long ago that showing it gave people like this permission to dismiss her. On whose authority did Lady Miriam issue that instruction? "Lady Miriam's authority," said Lady Miriam. She was standing at the far end of the border in a morning dress of deep plum silk, perfectly pressed, entirely inappropriate for a garden, which was the point. She moved toward Rosalind with the measured grace of a woman who had never needed to hurry because the world had always waited for her. She was perhaps 50, sharp-featured, beautiful in the architectural way of women who have decided to age on their own terms. Her eyes moved over Rosalind with the swift efficiency of a customs officer cataloguing contraband. "Miss Vane?" Her voice was warm. The warmth was a technique. "I've heard so much about your work." "Lady Miriam." Rosalind did not move from where she stood, which placed her between the men with the spades and the remaining undamaged border. "I'm afraid your men are destroying a restoration project that took 3 weeks to establish." "Restoring." Lady Miriam tilted her head slightly. "That's a generous word for it. What I see is native scrub and mud channels where formal borders should be." She glanced at the geranium colony, or what remained of it. "My brother's garden was one of the finest formal estates in the county before." "Before 1871, Rosalind said. "Yes, I've read the records. It was also a garden that required a staff of 9 to maintain at that standard. Does His Grace currently employ 9 gardeners?" A pause. "He employs you?" "He employs my firm to restore the garden to a standard it can sustain with the staff available. What I have designed requires 2 gardeners to maintain year-round. What your men are destroying this morning would require 6 minimum." She kept her eyes on Lady Miriam's. "Did your brother discuss this redesign with you before he left for London?" Something moved behind the older woman's expression. The answer was no. They both knew it. "My brother," Lady Miriam said pleasantly, "has been allowing grief to make his decisions for 3 years. Someone needs to make them properly." She glanced at the men. "Continue, please." "They will not," Rosalind said. "Quiet." "Absolute." "I have a signed contract specifying that alterations to the design require the Duke's written approval. If your men continue, I will have the grounds sealed as a matter of legal protection and ride to London myself to inform His Grace that his instructions are being countermanded in his own home." The men stopped. They were employed by Lady Miriam, but they were standing on the Duke's land, and apparently that distinction still meant something to them. Lady Miriam looked at Rosalind for a long moment. "You are remarkably bold," she said, "for a woman in your position. My position is contracted specialist. It comes with certain protections. Rosalind held her gaze. Lady Miriam, I understand you love your brother. I understand this estate matters to you. But the garden you remember died with your father, and rebuilding it exactly as it was won't bring either of them back. She said it gently because she meant it gently, even though she knew it would land like a blade. What I am building will outlast all of us. Yours won't survive the first winter without the staff to tend it. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the silence of something true meeting someone who was not ready to receive it. Lady Miriam's expression did not change, but something behind it did. My brother, she said finally, is not himself. I know, Rosalind said. He's becoming himself. There's a difference. Another silence, longer this time. Lady Miriam looked at the border, at the 3 uprooted lavender plants lying to one side, roots exposed to the afternoon air, already beginning to stress. Then she looked at Rosalind, not with warmth but with something that had moved slightly closer to consideration. Put the lavender back, she said to her men. Her voice was clipped and precise. Exactly as you found it. She turned and walked back toward the house without another word. Her silk hem whispered across the gravel. Her spine was perfectly straight. The men began with considerably less confidence than they had started with to put things back. Thomas appeared at Rosalind's shoulder. 30% damage, she said quietly, assessing the border. The catmint is a full loss. The geranium! I might save 2/3 of it if I get back in this afternoon. You're going to be here until dark? Yes. She pulled on her gloves. Get me the fork. She worked until she could no longer see clearly. When she finally stood and pressed her hands against the ache in her lower back, the stars were out and the walled garden was very quiet, and the border, damaged, diminished but not destroyed, was as restored as tonight's light and her own hands could manage. She gathered her tools. The sound of footsteps on the gravel came from the direction of the house. Quick, purposeful, wrong for this hour. She turned. The Duke of Ashmore was crossing the garden toward her in his travelling coat, still dusty from the road, his hair slightly disordered by what had clearly been a faster journey than usual. He looked at the border, at her, at the evidence of a day's damage written into the soil around them. I had a letter from Thomas, he said. You came back tonight. She heard the slight note of surprise in her own voice and couldn't entirely suppress it. It's my garden. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the set of his shoulders, not the controlled tension of the man who had arrived 3 days ago, but something rawer. What did she destroy? The catmint border is a full loss. I've saved most of the geranium. The lavender is back in the ground, but it'll need watching for the next week. She paused. I have a list. Full assessment of the damage with replacement costs. I can have it on your desk by morning. He looked at the border for a long moment. That is not, he said very quietly, what I came back tonight to discuss. She waited. He looked at her. The lantern Thomas had left at the gate cast a low gold light over everything. The turned earth, the surviving plants, her mud-caked gloves, his travel-worn coat. Are you all right? He said. The question was so simple and so entirely unexpected that she didn't answer immediately. In 11 years of professional work, no client had asked her that. Not once. They had asked about the damage to their property, the cost to their contracts, the impact on their schedules. No one had asked if she was all right. She found she had to be quite deliberate about her next breath. I'm unhurt, she said. The garden took the damage, not me. That isn't what I asked. She looked at him. His expression was open in a way she hadn't seen before, unguarded, slightly fierce, with an undertone of something that looked remarkably like anger on her behalf. She was not accustomed to being angry on behalf of. It sat strangely. I'm tired, she said, because it was true and he had asked. And I'm frustrated. And tomorrow I will have to buy replacement catmint with money that should be going toward the rose arbor and adjust the planting schedule by at least 4 days and explain to your sister that what she did today was not an act of love for this garden or for you. She paused. But I'm all right. He nodded slowly. Miriam, he said, will be spoken to tonight. She loves you, Rosalind said. She's frightened of losing this version of you. The one who is here, who is present, who is kneeling in mud and learning plant names. She thinks if she resets the garden to what it was before, she can reset everything else too. He was quiet for a moment. You understand her better than she deserves, he said. I understand people who confuse control with care, Rosalind said. It's a very common mistake. Something moved across his face. Recognition, perhaps. Or something adjacent to it, Miss Vane. He took a breath. I want you to know that what was contracted stands. Every decision about this garden is yours, not Miriam's, not mine, unless you invite it. A pause. You have my word on that. She looked at him for a long moment. She had received assurances from clients before. They were generally worth the air that carried them. This one felt different. She couldn't entirely say why. Thank you, Your Grace, she said. Julian, he said quietly, and then, as if he had surprised himself, my name is Julian. We have been kneeling in the mud together for 3 days. I think the formality has run its course. She held his gaze. Miss Vane, she said carefully, for now. The corner of his mouth moved. Progress, he said. She picked up her satchel. He walked with her to the gate, not escorting, simply walking as if neither of them had decided to do it and neither of them was going to mention it. At the gate, she lifted the latch. Same time tomorrow? He said. The geranium still needs finishing, she said. Then I'll be here. She went through the gate. The latch clicked behind her. The night air was cool and smelled of rain coming. She did not let herself think about the way he had said, "Are you all right?" The weight he had put under those 3 words, the way it had landed somewhere unguarded. She thought about it all the way home. The rain came on Friday and didn't stop. By Saturday morning, the walled garden was unusable, the amended soil too wet to work, the paths slick, the kind of persistent grey downpour that made outdoor labour not merely unpleasant, but actively counterproductive. Rosalind arrived at 7 regardless, assessed the situation in 4 minutes and relocated to the glass house. It was a good glass house. Victorian ironwork, south-facing, original cedar staging along both sides, neglected like everything else but structurally sound. She had been working in it steadily for 2 weeks, filling the staging with seedling trays and propagation pots and the careful, unglamorous infrastructure of a garden that didn't exist yet but would. She was potting on the climbing rose cuttings when she heard the door. Julian Ashmore ducked inside, shaking rain from his coat, and stopped when he saw her. "The garden," he began, "is too wet to work." She didn't look up. "I know. I'm here anyway." He looked around the glass house, at the ranked trays of seedlings, the labelled cuttings, the propagation sand, and the careful rows of terracotta pots. At the organised, purposeful industry of a space that had clearly been empty and dusty a month ago. "You built all of this," he said. "I propagated most of it. Some is bought in." She pressed the compost firm around the rose cutting and set it aside. "You don't have to stay. There's nothing for you to do today." He sat down on the low wooden stool at the end of the staging. "I'll watch," he said. She glanced at him. He was not watching in the way of a man performing patience. He was watching in the way of a man who wanted to understand something and had decided that watching was the most honest method. She returned to the roses. The rain intensified briefly, drumming on the glass above them, then settled back to its steady insistence. The glass house held its warmth, not the fierce dry heat of summer, but the gentle, damp warmth of growing things in an enclosed space, complex and green and entirely its own weather. "My father built this glass house," Julian said after a while. 1868, she said. "It's in the estate records. He brought the ironwork from a foundry in Birmingham. He grew peaches in here. Figs." A pause. "I used to steal them." He pretended not to notice. The quality of his voice was different in the glasshouse, quieter, with less of the careful control she had become accustomed to hearing him exercise, as if the enclosed space and the rain had changed the acoustics of something other than sound. "He would have liked you." Rosalind kept her hands moving. "Why?" she said. "He believed things should be tended properly or not at all. He had no patience for the performance of care without the substance of it." Julian looked at the nearest tray of seedlings. He also had no patience for people who let rank substitute for competence. He used to say that a title was an accident of birth and a skill was a choice, and only one of those things was actually yours. She looked up then. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the seedlings with the particular focus of someone using a middle distance to say something they couldn't quite say directly. "I never wanted the dukedom," he said. "My elder brother Edmund was meant to have it. He died at 23, a riding accident. Sudden, completely." He stopped. "And then it was mine. Then I had spent my entire life preparing to be something else entirely." "What?" she said. A pause. "An architect." He said it with the flatness of something long since surrendered. "I studied for 3 years, had a position secured with a firm in Edinburgh. I was—" Another pause, heavier than the others. "I was genuinely good at it. Not promising. Good." The rain moved across the glass in a slow wave. "And then Edmund died," she said. "And then Edmund died. and there was no one else. And the estate and the tenants and the obligations and the... He opened one hand briefly, a gesture that encompassed something too large for words. All of it. Overnight.
I was 26.
Rosalind set down the rose cutting she was holding. She thought about what to say and found that none of the professional, managed responses she had developed over 11 years were the right shape for this moment. "My father died when I was 22, she said. He looked at her. He was a gardener. Head gardener at Whitmore Hall for 30 years. She kept her voice steady. He taught me everything before he was well enough to teach me anything. I was in the kitchen gardens with him from the time I could walk. When he died, he left debts. Not large ones, but enough." She picked up the cutting again, turned it in her hands. "I had been working as an undergardener at 2 different estates. Women didn't hold senior positions. Everyone was very clear about that." She paused. "I decided to be very clear about something else." "You started your own firm," Julian said. "I started my own firm, with £12, a barrow, and my father's tools." The rose cutting went into the pot. "The first 3 clients were neighbours of former employers who hired me because they were curious. The 4th was Lady Pembridge, who hired me because I was right about her drainage problem, and everyone else had been telling her for 2 years that there wasn't one." She pressed the compost firm. "After that it was manageable. Not easy, manageable." Julian was watching her with an expression she had stopped trying to categorize. "You were angry," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "Every day," she said simply, "for about 3 years. Then I got too busy to maintain it properly and had to let most of it go." She glanced at him. The anger was useful for a while. It was very good fuel, but it's not a foundation. "What is?" She considered the question seriously. "Knowing that the work is real," she said finally. "That what you build exists after you leave. That the garden doesn't care about your father's title or your debts or what anyone thinks a woman should be doing. It just responds. To the right conditions, to the right attention." She looked at the ranks of seedlings. "That's not nothing. In a world that spends a great deal of energy on things that aren't real, it's actually quite a lot." Julian was quiet for a long time. The rain had gentled to something barely above mist. The glasshouse light had the particular quality of a grey day in an enclosed space. Soft, directionless, forgiving. "Eleanor, my wife, she loved this garden," he said. "That's part of why I couldn't..." He stopped, started again. "After she died, I couldn't be here without seeing the state of it. Everything overgrown and failing. It felt like evidence of neglect, of my absence." He paused. "She asked me before she died to restore it. She made me promise." A long pause. "I took 3 years to begin." "You began," Rosalind said. 3 years late." "Gardens don't keep a ledger of your failures," she said. "They only register what you do now." She looked at him steadily. "You're here. You're in the glass house on a Saturday in the rain when there's nothing required of you. You're learning the names of things you'll still be able to name in 20 years. A pause. "That's not 3 years late. That's on time." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had changed. The chronic, careful exhaustion she had noticed in their first days still present, but different now. Less defended, as if he had put something heavy down somewhere in the last 10 minutes and hadn't yet decided whether to pick it back up. "Rosalind," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Not Miss Vane, her name. He said it the way people said something they had been holding in their mouth for a while and had finally decided to release. She felt it move through her like a change in temperature. "Your Grace," she said. "Carefully." "Julian," he said. Just as carefully. She looked at the rose cutting in her hands, at the roots beginning to establish in the propagation sand, at the evidence of a slow, invisible process that had been happening without announcement for weeks. "Julian," she said quietly. He exhaled. Very slowly, outside the rain had almost stopped. Through the glass she could see the walled garden emerging from the grey, the soil darker, the replanted borders glistening, the emerging structure of what they had been building together visible for the first time in the washed, clarified light. They sat with that for a while, neither of them moving toward the thing that was very clearly present in the warm air between them, in the shared silence, in the names they had just given each other. She was his contracted specialist. He was the Duke of Ashmore. There were 17 reasons at minimum why the thing present in this glasshouse was not a thing that could be acted upon, and Rosalind Vane was a practical woman who had built her entire life on clear-eyed assessments of difficult situations. She picked up the next cutting. Tell me about Edinburgh, she said. And Julian Ashmore, Duke of Ashmore, who had not spoken about Edinburgh to anyone in 9 years, told her. The following Monday arrived with clear skies and no excuse not to work. Rosalind was grateful for it. She had spent Sunday in her rented rooms in the village doing accounts, writing supply orders, and not thinking about the glasshouse with a discipline she found quietly exhausting. By a Sunday evening, she had reached the conclusion she always reached when she applied her full intelligence to a problem. The clean, logical, correct conclusion that felt entirely wrong and was nonetheless entirely right. She was his contracted specialist. The contract ran 4 more weeks. She would finish it. She would do the work she had promised. She would accept the payment and the reference, and she would leave Ashmore Park with her professional reputation intact and her personal equilibrium restored, and that would be the correct outcome, and she would be satisfied with it. She arrived at 7 on Monday with this conclusion firmly in place. Julian was already there. He had improved considerably over the past 2 weeks. The gloves went on without instruction now. The fork was handled with something approaching confidence, and he had developed the particular focused quiet of someone who had discovered that physical work organized the mind in ways that nothing else quite managed. He looked better than he had on the first morning. Less haunted, more present. She found this easier not to notice when she was not standing directly next to him. "Eastbed," she said by way of greeting. "The rose standards need staking before the wind picks up." "Good morning," he said.
Good morning.
"The stakes are by the gate." They worked through the morning with the particular efficiency of people who had developed a shared rhythm. She directing, he following, both of them sufficiently experienced in each other's working style, now that most of it happened without words. He had learned to read her pauses. She had learned that his questions, when they came, were worth answering fully. It was comfortable. That was the problem. It was entirely dangerously comfortable. She was tying off the last rose standard when he said, without looking up from the stake he was driving, "You were quiet on Saturday evening when you left." "I had an early start Sunday," she said. "You always have an early start." She tied the knot. "Rosalind." He had stopped driving the stake. When she didn't respond immediately, he moved around the rose bush so that he was in her eye line. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She reached for the next length of twine. "I'm tying roses." "You've been managing me again since you arrived this morning." He said it without accusation, as a plain observation. "The same way you were managing me on the first day." Calibrated. A pause. "I thought we'd moved past that." She tied the twine. She moved to the next stake. She was aware of him watching her, and she kept her eyes on the rose. "Miss Vane," he said, and the return to formality was deliberate. She heard it as clearly as a door closing.
She stopped.
She set down the twine. She turned to face him, and she made herself look at him directly, which was harder than it should have been in the full morning light, with the roses between them, and the expression on his face entirely open. "I think," she said carefully, "that we have allowed the circumstances to become—" She reached for the right word and settled for honest. "Unclear." He waited. "We are in a glasshouse together on rainy days. We are in the garden together every morning. You told me about Edinburgh. I told you about my father. These are—" She paused. "These are things that happen when proximity and shared work create a context that is—" Another pause. "That feels more significant than it is." "Does it?" he said. Not a question. "Yes." She kept her voice level. "You've been isolated here, Your Grace. You've been grieving and working and learning things your hands hadn't done before, and that creates a kind of openness, a lowering of the usual." She gestured vaguely. "And I am here, and we work well together, and I understand the garden, and you find that—" She stopped. "What?" he said quietly. "Attractive," she said. "In the way one finds competence attractive when one is learning. It's a recognizable pattern. It's not—" She took a careful breath. "It isn't the same as what it might appear to be. In 3 months' time, when the garden is finished and I have gone on to the next commission, you'll understand that." Julian looked at her for a long time. He had picked up the length of twine she had set down. He was turning it over in his hands, not looking at it, looking at her. "That," he said eventually, "is the most thoroughly constructed piece of self-protection I have ever heard delivered as an objective assessment." The accuracy of it landed precisely where he had aimed it. She kept her expression neutral. "It's an honest analysis. It is a perfectly logical argument for not feeling something you clearly feel." He said it gently, without triumph, which made it considerably worse. "I've been making the same argument to myself for about 10 days. I recognize the architecture." "Julian, I'm not asking you for anything," he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not—" He stopped. Began again. "I am not the sort of man who uses his position to pressure a woman who is dependent on his professional reference. I would like you to know that about me." "I know that about you," she said quietly. "Then stop treating this as a problem you need to solve by making it smaller than it is." A pause. "I know what proximity feels like. I know what grief does to a person's judgment. I also know—" He stopped. "What?" she said against her better instincts. "That I've spent every morning for 3 weeks learning the names of things I will still be able to name in 20 years, he said. "And I would like to keep doing that, in whatever form you are willing to allow." She looked at him. The twine was still in his hands. The roses were staked and tied, and the east bed was almost finished. Above the wall, a cloud moved across the sun, and the light shifted, cooled briefly, steadied. Everything she had concluded on Sunday was still true. It was still the right conclusion. "We have 4 weeks left on the contract," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need to finish the garden." "I know. It has to be the thing," she said. "For now, the garden. That's what I'm here for." He held her gaze. She could see the cost of it, the deliberate restraint of a man who had asked for nothing and was accepting the terms without argument. "For now," he said quietly. Those 2 words were either a concession or a door left open. She was not sure which. She was not sure she was willing to examine the difference closely enough to find out. "The geranium border still needs the front edge resetting," she said. "Then we should do that," he said. She picked up her trowel. He picked up the fork. They moved to the geranium border and they worked side by side in the careful silence of 2 people who had said something true and returned to the safer territory of the task at hand. By noon, the east bed was finished. She did not look at him more than was necessary for the rest of the day. She was quite successful at it, on balance, except for the one moment, mid-afternoon, when he said something quietly funny about the catmint refusing to cooperate, and she laughed before she could stop herself, and he looked at her with an expression that made the Sunday conclusion feel very far away, and not entirely as convincing as it had seemed in her rented rooms with the accounts spread across the table and the sensible empty hours of a Sunday stretching out around her. She stayed late to check the drainage channels. She told herself this was about the drainage channels. Walking home through the village as the light failed, she found herself thinking of architects and Edinburgh and fathers who taught their children the names of growing things and the way a man's voice changed in a glasshouse in the rain, quieter and realer and entirely without the management of rank. She thought about what he had said. "I know the architecture," she thought. "So do I. I designed it specifically so it would hold." She thought, "I am not certain it is going to hold." She walked faster. The evening was cool. The catmint she had replanted after Lady Miriam's men had torn it out was, if she had assessed the root shock correctly, going to recover fully. Things recovered given the right conditions. That was either reassuring or the most dangerous thought she'd had all week. She went home. She did the accounts. She went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, hand-delivered by one of the house footmen, written on Ashmore Park stationery in a hand that was not Julian's. "Miss Vane, His Grace requests the pleasure of your company at the Ashmore Harvest Benefit, Saturday the 14th, 7 o'clock. Carriages at 11. Formal dress. Hartley, on behalf of the Duke of Ashmore." Rosalind read it twice, set it on the table beside her breakfast. Read it a 3rd time. Thomas, who had developed over 4 weeks the particular sensitivity of a man working in close proximity to a complicated situation he had decided was not his business, said nothing. He drank his tea. He looked out of the window at the garden. "It's a charity benefit," Rosalind said, "to no one in particular." Said Thomas. "The tenant farmers attend." "The local physicians. The vicar." She set the letter down. It's a community event. It would be strange not to go. I've been working on this estate for a month." Said Thomas. She looked at him. He looked at the window. She went to the benefit. She borrowed a dress from her friend Clara in the village. Deep green silk, well cut, 3 years old but well kept, the kind of dress that didn't announce itself but wore well in good company. She pinned her hair herself, which took longer than she preferred and produced a result that was competent rather than elegant, and told herself it didn't matter how it looked. The carriage Julian sent, she had not asked for it, it simply arrived at 6:45, was warm and too comfortable and smelled of cedar, and she sat in it with her hands folded in her lap and her Sunday conclusion marshalled firmly in place, and told herself this was simply a professional courtesy. A client acknowledging the work of a specialist, nothing more than that. Ashmore Park at night was a different house. The windows blazed. Music drifted from the open doors onto the gravel sweep where carriages were arriving in a steady stream. The entrance hall had been filled with flowers, late roses trailing ivy, the last of the summer's bronze chrysanthemums, and she noted with a professional satisfaction that the arrangement on the central table used 3 varieties she had propagated in the glasshouse, now cut and deployed without any awareness of where they had come from. She found this quietly pleasing. She found him in the doorway of the drawing room before he found her. He was in evening dress, which should not have altered anything, and did. Not because it made him more impressive. She had seen him on his knees in the mud with a broken blister on his palm, which was considerably more revealing than any tailoring. But because it reminded her, with a clarity she had been successfully avoiding for 10 days, of the exact distance between Rosalind Vane, contracted specialist, and the Duke of Ashmore in his own house. He turned. He saw her. Something in his expression changed in a way she filed carefully away and did not examine. "You came," he said. "You sent a carriage," she said. "I wasn't certain you'd get in it." "It was raining," she said. He smiled. The real one, the one she had first seen on the afternoon he had sat down in the mud with the lavender in his hands, surprised out of him, not performed. She had, over the course of 4 weeks, become distressingly familiar with the difference. "Come," he said, "I want you to meet the Pembridges." The first hour was fine. More than fine. Lady Pembridge was warm and specific in her praise, which meant something because Lady Pembridge's praise was neither warm nor specific by default. The vicar asked knowledgeable questions about the Rose Arbour. The estate physician, a quiet Scotsman named Dr. Fellows, turned out to have strong opinions about soil drainage and kept her occupied for 20 minutes with a level of genuine engagement she hadn't expected. Julian stayed near her without staying beside her, present enough to introduce, absent enough to give her room. She noticed the calibration of it. It was, she thought, the behaviour of a man who had thought carefully about what she would find comfortable and acted accordingly. This did not help with the Sunday conclusion. She was talking to Lady Pembridge about the catmint recovery when she became aware of a shift in the room's social weather, the particular atmospheric change that happens when someone enters a gathering and the gathering rearranges itself slightly in response. She looked toward the door. Lady Miriam had arrived. She was dressed immaculately, predictably, in the kind of gown that cost enough to communicate its own argument. Beside her was a young woman Rosalind didn't recognize, perhaps 25, fair-haired, with the particular grace of someone raised to occupy a room without appearing to try. She moved through the gathering with the ease of a woman who had been to 100 such evenings and found them all slightly beneath her but endured them with good breeding. Lady Pembridge followed Rosalind's gaze. "Ah," she said, with the delicate neutrality of a woman who had opinions she had decided not to share. "Lady Cecily Fairfax, Miriam's particular project this season." Rosalind looked at her. Daughter of Lord Fairfax of Harrogate, impeccable family. Excellent estate. One mace, a nice, ain't see. Lady Pembridge smoothed her glove. "Miriam has been suggesting the match since February." Rosalind returned her attention to Lady Pembridge and kept it there, which required a small but perceptible act of will. "The catmint," she said, "should be fully recovered by October." She did not look at Julian for the next 20 minutes. When she did, it was because the room's social gravity had shifted again, everyone angling by small and imperceptible degrees toward the same point. Julian and Lady Cecily were standing near the fireplace. Lady Miriam was 3 feet away with the expression of a woman watching a chess piece move into position. Lady Cecily was speaking, animated, bright, accomplishing it all with the practiced naturalness of someone who had been trained to be exactly this charming in exactly these circumstances. Julian was listening. He was not. She assessed this with the same careful precision she applied to soil samples and drainage gradients, not looking at Lady Cecily the way he looked at Rosalind when she was explaining something he hadn't understood yet. He was looking at her with the polite, slightly distant attention of a man performing a social obligation. But then Lady Miriam said something, and Julian glanced up, and his eyes found Rosalind across the room, and then he looked back at Lady Cecily. It lasted perhaps 1 second. Less. The duration of a breath not quite taken. It was enough. Rosalind had spent 11 years reading situations with precision, reading what was underneath what was presented, reading what the soil said underneath what the surface showed. She read this one accurately and without any of the self-protective optimism that might have made it easier. He had hesitated. Not toward Lady Cecily, not in the way Lady Miriam intended, but he had hesitated, and in that hesitation she had seen the full, clear shape of everything she had been refusing to name for 4 weeks. The weight of it, the complexity of it, the specific impossibility of it given who he was and what she was, and what the distance between them measured in real terms rather than glasshouse terms on rainy Saturdays. She set down her glass. "Lady Pembridge," she said with a smile she had been using professionally since she was 19. "Will you forgive me? I have an early start tomorrow." "Of course, my dear." Lady Pembridge pressed her hand briefly. The press lasted a fraction of a second longer than courtesy required. "Come and see me when you're finished at Ashmore. I have a kitchen garden that has been asking for your attention for 2 years. I'll write to you," Rosalind said. She collected her wrap from the hallway. She did not look for Julian. She went out through the side door that opened onto the kitchen garden terrace, the one she had been using since the first week because it was closer to the walled garden and she had stopped thinking of herself as a guest weeks ago. The night air hit her, cool and clean and real. The gravel path was pale in the moonlight. The kitchen garden was dark and very quiet. Above the wall she could see the top of the espaliered pear she had tied against the south-facing brickwork in week 2, the one she had argued for when Julian had said it seemed optimistic. "Things that are worth having take longer than you think," she had said. "That's not a reason not to plant them." She walked toward the gate. Behind her, from the lit windows of the house, she could hear music beginning again, something bright and formal, the sound of a room arranging itself into patterns that had been established long before she arrived and would continue long after she left. She found the gate latch in the dark and lifted it. She walked through. She was packed before dawn. Not because she had decided to leave. She had 4 days remaining on the contract and Rosalind Vane did not abandon contracts, but because packing gave her hands something to do at 4 in the morning when sleep had conclusively failed, and the alternative was lying in the dark, arriving at conclusions she had already arrived at and did not need to arrive at again. The garden was essentially finished. The rose arbor would need its second training in spring, but the structure was sound. The drainage channels had transformed the south bed entirely. The lavender divisions had taken. The catmint had recovered. The espaliered pear was showing 3 inches of new growth against the south wall, which was, given everything, the detail she was most quietly proud of. She had done what she came to do. She would write the final report on Thursday. She would walk the completed garden with Julian on Friday morning, professionally, thoroughly, with the full and documented handover notes that every client received. And she would accept the payment and the reference, and she would get into whatever carriage was going toward the village, and she would not look back. This was the plan. She was still awake at 5, which is when she decided to go to the garden. The walled garden at dawn was the best version of itself. She had known this for weeks, but had not allowed herself to simply be in it at this hour, without a task, without a fork or a soil sample or a planting schedule. She went in through the gate and stood in the middle of it and looked. The rose arbor ran the full length of the west wall, bare-caned now but structured. She could see exactly what it would be in June, the shape of it already present in the framework she had built. The borders were planted, settled, showing the quiet authority of things properly established. The drainage channels were invisible, doing their work underground. The espaliered pear was a dark line against the paler stone, disciplined and purposeful, growing towards something. She stood there for a long time. She was still standing there when she heard the gate. She didn't turn. She heard the footsteps. She knew them now as well as she knew her own, which was one of the things she had been most diligently not thinking about. And she kept her eyes on the rose arbor and waited. He stopped a few feet behind her. Neither of them spoke. The sky above the wall was doing the slow, complicated work of becoming morning, dark blue softening at the edges, the first birds beginning their provisional assessment of the new day. "You left," he said. "I was tired. I looked for you." She kept her eyes on the roses. "You had guests." "I had Lady Cecily Fairfax performing extremely accomplished conversation and my sister watching to see if it was working." A pause. "It wasn't working." "Julian, I looked for you," he said again, "because the room was full of people and you were the only person in it I wanted to talk to, and then you weren't there, and I—" He stopped. "I came to find you last night. Thomas said you'd gone home. I came anyway and stood outside your lodgings like a man with very poor judgment and considerably less dignity than he started the evening with. She turned then. He was in yesterday's evening clothes, the coat slightly rumpled, the cravat loosened in the way she had stopped finding charming and failed. He looked like a man who had not slept and had stopped caring about the evidence of it. He looked, she thought, more like himself than he had at any point in the past 4 weeks, which was saying something given that their most honest conversations had happened on their knees in the mud. "You should have slept," she said.
Undoubtedly.
He looked at her steadily. "I want to say something. I need you to let me say it before you give me the logical argument for why I shouldn't." She said nothing. He took this as permission. "I am not confused about what I feel," he said. "I want to be clear about that first, because I know you've been telling yourself that I am, that this is grief or proximity, or the particular softness of a man learning to use his hands again. And I understand why you've been telling yourself that. I've been watching you construct that argument for 2 weeks, and I've had the considerable self-discipline not to take it apart in front of you because you needed to build it at your own pace." "Julian, let me finish. Not sharp, just certain. I have been a duke for 15 years. I have sat in rooms with accomplished, well-bred, suitable women for 15 years, and I know exactly what it feels like to be with someone I esteem but do not." He paused. "And I know what this feels like, which is entirely different." The dawn was coming on faster now. The stone walls of the garden were emerging from grey into their actual colour. "You are the most competent person I have ever met," he said. "You came into this garden and you read what was wrong with it in 4 minutes and you fixed it in 5 weeks and you never once asked me to make it easier for you. You told my sister the truth about grief in a way that I haven't been able to tell her in 3 years. You laughed at me when I sat in the mud and I have been thinking about that laugh since the morning it happened." He stopped, drew a breath. "I love the way you hold a trowel. I love that you know what pH means and that you assume I can learn it too. I love that you said for now and meant it as a promise, and I have been holding on to that for now for 10 days. She was looking at him. She had stopped constructing the Sunday conclusion somewhere around "I know what this feels like." "You hesitated," she said. "Last night, when Miriam introduced Lady Cecily, I looked for you," he said immediately. "That was the hesitation. I looked for you across the room to see if you were watching, and I should not have done it because you were watching and you read it wrong." He took 2 steps toward her, not closing the distance entirely, leaving her room. "I am not my sister's project. I am not going to marry a woman of impeccable family because Miriam has decided 3 years of grief is sufficient, and I should now resume my duties. He stopped. "I am standing in my own garden at 5 in the morning in yesterday's clothes because I could not sleep, and I could not let you leave on Friday thinking that I hesitated toward her." The birds had increased their assessment of the morning. The sky above the east wall was the specific pale colour that preceded actual light by about 10 minutes. "I have 4 days left on the contract," she said. "I know. I need to finish the garden." "I know that too." He looked at her with the expression she had been most carefully not looking at for weeks, open and unguarded and entirely without the performance of rank or restraint. "I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to stop pretending that the Sunday conclusion is actually what you think." She looked at him for a long moment. "At the rumpled evening coat. At the mud that was," she noted this with a precision she couldn't help, already on his left boot from the path. At his hands, which had blisters healed to calluses now, which had learned the difference between forcing and tending, which had spent 5 weeks being taught by hers. "It was a very good argument," she said. "It was a masterpiece," he said. "It was completely convincing and entirely wrong." Something shifted in her chest. The specific movement of a carefully constructed thing acknowledging that it is no longer load-bearing. "I have no idea," she said slowly, "how this is supposed to work. The practical reality of it. What it would—" She gestured at the space between them, which encompassed approximately 15,000 acres of estate and several centuries of social architecture and a contract that had 4 days remaining on it. "Neither do I," he said. "Not yet. That doesn't concern you?" "I'm an architect," he said. "Or I was. I understand that you don't begin with the full plan. You begin with the foundation and you build what the foundation makes possible." A pause. "I think we have rather a good foundation." She thought about espaliered pears and amended soil and things that grew slowly in the right conditions towards something that wasn't visible yet, but was already structurally inevitable.
4 days, she said.
4 days, he agreed.
The garden first?
Always the garden first. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned back to the rose arbor and looked at the shape of what they had built together, the bones of it, bare and structured and fully, unmistakably real. "The front canes on the arbor need a second tie before I hand over," she said. "The wind will take them otherwise." "Then I'll get the twine," he said.
It's 5 in the morning.
"The light is almost good enough." He moved to the wall where the tools were racked and found the twine without being shown where it was, because he knew where everything was now, because he had spent 5 weeks learning. He brought it back. He held one end. He looked at her.
She looked at him.
"Show me," he said. She took the twine. She showed him. Above the east wall the sun came over. 3 months later the roses flowered. Not all of them. It was October, and October did not owe anyone roses, but the late flowering climbers on the west wall, the ones she had spent the better part of week 3 training against the new framework, had produced a final flush that neither of them had been certain to expect. Deep pink, fragrant, entirely improbable in the autumn light. Julian had sent a letter about them the morning he noticed, which had arrived on her desk at her next commission in Derbyshire, with a pressed petal folded inside it, and no explanation, as if the petal were sufficient context. It was. She had written back, "The west wall gets afternoon sun until nearly 4 o'clock in October. I told you it would flower. You doubted me. I am noting this formally for the record." He had replied, "The record notes your vindication. The record also notes that I was on my knees in the mud when I saw them, which I consider a reasonable tribute. When do you finish in Derbyshire?" She had looked at that last sentence, no question mark, characteristic, for slightly longer than was necessary before writing Friday. He had met her at the station, not with a carriage. He was standing on the platform in his ordinary coat, the one he wore in the garden, with the particular expression of a man who has been slightly early and is not going to admit to it. He had mud on his left boot. She noticed this immediately and felt something warm and specific move through her that she had entirely stopped pretending was professional esteem. "The catmint," he said by way of greeting. "Good," she said. "Fully recovered. Even the section by the gate. I said it would be. You say a great deal of things with considerable confidence and are generally correct." He took her bag. She let him. "The geranium border is—" "Julian. Established, I was going to say. Julian." "What?" She looked at him on the platform with the Derbyshire light behind him and the bag in his hand and the mud on his boot and the expression he had never quite learned to fully manage. The one that appeared when he was trying not to show that something mattered and failing entirely. "Hello," she said. Something in his face did what it always did when she surprised him, the controlled composure cracking slightly, the real thing showing through. "Hello," he said. They walked out of the station. It was not simple. She wanted to be clear-eyed about that because she had been clear-eyed about everything else and saw no reason to stop now. Lady Miriam had required 3 separate conversations and a tour of the completed garden conducted by Julian with the specific and prepared thoroughness of a man making an argument he intended to win. She had arrived at something that was not precisely warmth, but was, Rosalind assessed, genuine respect, the kind that Miriam Ashmore gave very few people and retracted from even fewer once granted. This was workable. Rosalind was good with workable. Society required management rather than defiance, which was a different skill set but not an inaccessible one. Lady Pembridge had been, characteristically, decisively, the first to make the geometry of it publicly legible by the simple method of inviting them both to dinner in September and seating them together and telling anyone who raised an eyebrow that Miss Vane had restored her kitchen garden and the Duke of Ashmore had excellent taste in specialists. This had settled a great deal. There were still rooms Rosalind entered and felt the precise weight of assessment. She expected this would continue for some time. She had been managing assessment since she was 19 years old and remained, on balance, adequately equipped for it. The work continued. This was the part she had not expected to love as much as she did, that it continued, that there was always another commission, that she came home from Derbyshire and Hampshire, and the increasingly ambitious projects that Lady Pembridge's recommendation kept generating. And there was the garden at Ashmore waiting, still growing, still requiring attention, still telling her things if she listened. Julian had learned to listen to it too. Slowly, imperfectly, with the particular tenacity of a man who had decided something was worth learning and was not going to be deterred by being bad at it initially. He knew the names of everything in the walled garden. He had developed strong opinions about the catmint, which he found both endearing and faintly absurd. He had written to a firm in Edinburgh in September, a different firm from the one he had been placed with 20 years ago, but the same city, the same discipline, about a small project on the estate. A folly, he said. Something he had been drawing in the margins of his correspondence for 3 years. She had looked at the drawings. They were good. She had told him so with the same directness she applied to soil assessments and drainage gradients, and he had looked at her the way he always looked at her when she said something true without managing it, which was to say with an expression that still, 3 months on, required a certain amount of composure to receive. They were in the walled garden on a Saturday in October, she reviewing the final growth records from the restoration, he making a systematic and largely unsuccessful attempt to train the last of the rose canes into their winter position. When he said, without looking up from the rose, "I have a question." "The cane goes left," she said. "Not right." "I know where the cane goes." He moved it left. "Different question." She looked up from her notebook. He was still looking at the rose with the careful focus of a man who had decided to approach something obliquely because approaching it directly was beyond him at this particular moment. She waited. She had learned his pace. It was slower than hers in some things and considerably faster in others, and she had stopped trying to adjust it. He reached into his coat pocket. He set something on the top of the garden wall. She looked at it. It was a ring. Simple, old, a thin gold band set with a single dark stone, garnet or ruby, the colour of the October roses behind her. The kind of ring that had belonged to someone before and carried that history in its weight. "It was my grandmother's," he said to the rose cane. She was, by all accounts, a woman who said exactly what she thought and was right approximately 90% of the time, which I understand is below your average, but was considered remarkable for the 1840s. Rosalind looked at the ring on the wall. "Julian," she said. "It's not." He turned from the rose cane and looked at her, and the oblique approach was entirely abandoned now, his expression direct and unguarded and slightly terrified in the specific way of a man who has built a foundation carefully and is now standing on it and finding it holds. "I'm not asking you to stop working. I'm not asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are, which is the most precise and infuriating and necessary person I have ever met. I'm asking..." He stopped. "I'm asking if we might make the arrangement somewhat more permanent." She looked at him. At the mud on his boot, there was always mud on his boot now, which she considered one of her more lasting contributions to the estate. At his hands, which knew the names of everything in this garden. At the ring on the wall between them, small and dark and patient. "The geranium border," she said, "will need dividing again in spring." He blinked. "You'll need someone to show you how to do it without sitting down in the mud," she said. "You've improved considerably, but the geranium is still beyond you." The expression that crossed his face was the one she loved most, the one that was surprise and relief and the particular helpless warmth of a man who had stopped being surprised by her and somehow remained surprised every time. "Is that—" "Yes," she said, simply, clearly, with the same directness she applied to everything that mattered. "That's a yes." He picked up the ring from the wall. He was smiling, the real one, the one from the mud and the glass house and the station platform, not performed, not managed, entirely his. "You're going to make me wait," he said. "I'm going to finish my notes first," she said, returning to her notebook. "The west wall records need to be complete before the light goes." "Rosalind." "The ring will still be there in 20 minutes, she said. "The light won't." He laughed, short and genuine, startled out of him. He put the ring in his pocket with the careful attention of a man entrusting it to safekeeping. He turned back to the rose cane. "The left one," she said, without looking up. "I know," he said. Above the wall, the October sky was doing something extravagant with the late afternoon light, all gold and amber, the kind of sky that only happened at this hour in this month, that you had to be paying attention to catch. The roses were flowering against the warm stone. The geranium border was fully established, the catmint recovered, the espaliered pear putting on its last inch of growth before the cold came. She wrote the final numbers in her notebook. He trained the last rose cane into position. Neither of them spoke for a while. The garden settled around them into the specific quiet of a place that has been properly tended, not the silence of neglect, but the silence of things growing in the right conditions, doing their slow, invisible, entirely certain work. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself hoping for her yes or holding your breath at that ring on the garden wall, I hope it reminded you of something true, that the right person learns the names of the things you love, that they show up 3 days early and stay in the rain and sit down in the mud without complaint, that when they choose you, they do it on a station platform in an ordinary coat with mud on their boot, not because the moment is grand, but because they couldn't wait another hour. That's what choosing looks like when it's real. If Rosalind and Julian's story moved you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Prince Pedro's Love Bait, where every story is about being chosen properly or not at all.